This recording is, let me say, I guess it's potentially dangerous of the things that I'm going to speculate on. As in, perhaps morally dangerous. Well, I mean, in my worldview, any sort of opinion or point of view is essentially sort of, or when I say it's morally dangerous, I mean sort of it's morally dangerous if it misleads other people because everyone is responsible for their own evaluations and such. So essentially, there's a moral weight. There's a potential sort of moral reflection and ripple. Anyway, this is too vague. An introduction for the subject. So, what I want to talk about is something that I've sort of been getting to the point at in some of my discussions of psychology, is essentially correlating the devotion to collective narcissism, to cultural, in some sense. I think the devotion doesn't necessarily have to do with collective narcissism and let's say certain forms of politics and things like that. They can be separated, and I'm going to make the case that they should be separated, that we do in fact need a secular substrate within society just to sort of preserve sanity itself, that there must be a division between secular and because otherwise you just don't have layers of intimacy, you don't have layers of internal you don't have a clear delineation between an internal locus of control and an external locus of control, essentially, which is what I think all these things somewhat hinge on. Like when people have an external locus of control, which is what is, I think, facilitated by having. I think this is why certain societies are so culturally pathetic and decrepit and sort of spiral out of control is when you have a kind of fascistic, totalitarian, or authoritarian politics in which your identity is conferred on you by, let's say, the hard institutional power and structure of the state, and there isn't enough space for the individual to understand these things and to work out a culture which is the amalgamation of individual deliberation on those topics. That you don't have a culture that is informed by individual agency. It is a composite or a reflection of hard power and traditional values or something like that. Instead of, I mean, I'm not against traditional values, but they have to, I think, be authentically lived in the culture, or let's say breathed or believed in culturally. I'm not against sort of inheriting views, as it were. I just don't want those views to be imposed through the destruction of a secular liberal order as a kind of, as the general container, as the overarching framework where you can actually have a culture that says that it truly endorses its own views, and so that the, let's say, the framework of this kind of culture then really gives you the sophistication or the complexity of having gradations of identity. You know, that somewhat the psychology of sophistication is institutionalized in the structure. Anyway, and then essentially, you know, all this is how then I criticize many fascistic thinkers, because they're trying to find like a really good lowest common denominator that would be sort of some kind of, it would offer some kind of utilitarian moral expediency that, you know, well, it would be greater for the greatest good of the greatest number of the population if we created a political mythology around their identity, because then they would do the right thing, which is not really what I'm concerned with, because for me it's not important for people to do the right thing. It's to have an understand. It's not just to have a, some kind of high trust society. It's to have a high fidelity society, a high integrity society, because if you have trust without integrity, it's prone to being essentially a Ponzi scheme. So I would say that, it is actually morally unsustainable, and that moral corruption will manifest in some sense, even if it's a kind of nescience, which, in some sense is the thing that totalitarians or authoritarians or sort of fascistic values is trying to exploit, that for its supposed for its hypothetically good, um, that essentially the reason why fascist politics can make convincing arguments in a kind of utilitarian, or hypothetically it can make convincing arguments, is because it's utilizing nescience on its side. Hypothetically, you could create a mythology that has some kind of ulterior, that the ends will be that the means will be justified by the ends, that you can kind of control things to be better, and the basis of that control is a kind of instilled nescience in the population. Anyway, so these are all things that end up colonizing people from being able to have, let's say, a proper internal locus of control, or a proper, therefore also sexual energy. And I mean this, not necessarily correlating exactly with sex itself, but perhaps with some kind of charisma. Or so. Anyway, I've explained how I think that the devotion is therefore then people that have toxic devotions. They have a kind of toxic charisma. They have a kind of collective narcissism packed into their worldview. This is sort of a juvenile thing to some degree. I think that I've kind of explained how modern feminism is an example of this kind of totalitarian political thing, because people have an ideological project which is somewhat built on scapegoating masculine sexual energy, and therefore they can just project things onto masculine sexual energy and blame the state of society on masculine sexual energy, and essentially they've created a whole sexual political expression around denigrating male sexual energy. And that is the fuel and the glue that fixes their identity. So they can sort of politically explore having a different identity by blaming the ideological scapegoat for not already providing to them what their grievance is. So all they have to do is have a grievance about something, and it's a kind of sexual projection of engaging in imagination about themselves. This is something that would usually be done behind closed doors in the bedroom. That's a kind of imagination that would be done in what is called the realm of intimacy. But these people don't have layers of intimacy. They have a political expression of that kind of intimacy. And in some sense, because it's centered around an external locus of control and it's fundamentally reactive, when they do engage in actual sex, it's probably well, I mean, I know this somewhat firsthand, and I can also do this by extrapolation, that it's very crude, it's very vulgar, because essentially, because their worldview is centered around an external locus of control, the sexual imagination and how they have to explore that is going to be essentially along the same themes, because those are the themes that inform their sense of self. So if they want to tease out and disentangle and deconstruct their sense of self and explore what would make their sense of self evolve or adapt, it's very much thematically going to be related in dominance and submission and subjugation. And I even think that they can't even look. I mean, it's going to be a mixed bag, and I'm somewhat, it's probably sex positive feminists are going to be slightly differently dysfunctional to other kinds of feminists. But I think generally the thing is that how they are intellectually conceiving of their own sexual, obviously this is not going to be true across the board for all of them. Maybe some of them do have a completely sort of compartmentalized sex life, where they just say, well, sex has got nothing to do with my ideology, and they have a kind of fantasy sex life that is completely distinct. But usually the fantasy is going to be um, related to whatever their core motif of identity is going to be thematically correspondent to how they conceive themselves in the deepest sense. And so it almost perhaps depends how comprehensively they have been colonized by the external locus of control ideology, and how much they have reconceived of themselves as that. And the more that they do that, the more that they will essentially be incapable of let's say of what I would describe as genuine intimacy, because they would essentially anyway. I think that what I'm trying to drive at is what I've already kind of explained in other recordings, is that the whole sort of dominatrix fetish idiom, that can you see some glimmer of love within the transactional exchange of submission, and I think that is basically what is being explored in the kind of dominatrix setup. And I do think that there's a reason why German people have a stereotype for sort of being the most sort of fetishized population. In some sense, obviously, that particular stereotype, I think, is directly correlated to the political fascism that they went through and how that affected their culture. And obviously now that's going to be a much broader experience of people all over the world, now that this ideology has spread, this kind of external locus of anyway. So anyway, I'm just using that as a thing to paint a picture of what I'm sort of talking at. Anyway, so I've been talking about these types of issues, and obviously there are gradations of this, where people that have generalizations in their head. Now, you can't escape forming generalizations, but how much moral gravity generalizations contain will generally, I think, conform to how much sort of collective narcissism you have kind of has seeped into your worldview, which in some sense that's why these things crop up in sexuality so much. That's why stereotypes and are explored so much. That's why role play is often has to do with kind of like what's hot in the zeitgeist, or what is in some sense on the underbelly of the cultural conversation. It's a kind of it's a meditation on what drives the engine of informing your of determining your sense of self, or your sense of for that you be, of that you be. That's what the devotion is anyway. So, and obviously if this is if that engine, if that fuel that informs what that you be is it comes from the outside, and therefore is going to be prominent within the culture, or be thematically linked to some trope within the culture, or some idiom, or some occurrence, or something like that, it makes sense that people would create a sexual play around that, in order to see how they relate to it, because it is already important to them to know, because it either defines them implicitly or explicitly by either explicit engagement or confrontation, or innate, sort of that it just, it's sort of like the elephant in the room in culture, and if they don't look at it, it doesn't mean that it's not occupying the space of the room or something like that. Sorry, a bit of a mixed metaphor, but okay, so uh, I do think that the, let's say, responsible, or not responsible, but mature sexual play to some degree is going to be related to a kind of ironic attachment to exploring these kinds of things. That anyway, and a kind of a proper synthesis of some shared exploit into some kind of existential uh, investigation on the level of integrating oneself into some kind of embodied cultural or community or societal um, compact or treaties or something like that. Because you have to delineate the internal structures so that you can actually have a social mask, as it were, so that you can make the boundaries clear within your own constitutive uh, uh, evaluation. Anyway, you have to know where you end and society begins, or something like that. Now, I do think that we essentially are in a very sort of sick society, made sick by this kind of totalitarian identity politics ideology, which essentially says that everything that I've been complaining about, they complain about that it's being done to them, so they have to kind of fight fire with fire. Is there kind of reactionary sort of excuse for it, that it's being imposed on them, so they have to be aware of it, otherwise they can't resist it. And then they're stuck in the sort of in the Jungian paradox that what you resist persists, that they are recreating it and reproducing it, and in some sense it's entirely, I would argue, a figment of their psychological commitment to an external locus of control. They are philosophically locked into producing the thing that they are supposedly combating. It's very ironic, but yeah, it has to do with the very poor thinking that goes into their philosophical premises, also. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that there, into that in this recording. What is my point? So anyway, now I'm back to what I was talking about earlier, which is the need to have a kind of spiritual, which also involves, therefore, the subject of sexual energy, at least, politics. And I do think that, this is why I say that there is a psychological need to preserve, let's say, British political liberal sort of democratic values. And look, I mean, I'm not saying Britain isn't even necessarily a good model of this, at least culturally at the moment. You can kind of see how the culture has lost certain aspects of its sort of distinctiveness, or at least, I mean, not the culture, all of it, but in terms of how its institutions, like the media institutions, especially, poorly reflect those, let's say, those lines that have been crossed, which I think most famously were crossed, and this was even documented by Hitchens, by oh my word, this is embarrassing. I always get them mixed up. I think it was documented by Christopher Hitchens, which was covering how the BBC particularly mourned the death of Princess Diana, and how essentially the tone of the coverage was violating this kind of secular private domain, where the news anchor, when covering the mourning of Diana, would say, "We are in mourning," speaking for the audience. And that was, I think, a cultural sort of watershed moment, which I won't repeat the whole thing. You can actually find that sort of mini documentary on YouTube. But anyway, there's a very good sort of cultural document which I think is important. That the essentially the degradation of the kind of the psychological cultural scaffolding that holds up the liberal order, as it were, um, where this kind of cultural hegemony and political project that has so much sexual energy inculcated within its project, or within how it functions as a ideological um, program, uh, has been able to install itself in a culture that has kind of lost its principles and its integrity, or those principles and those aspects of how the integrity functioned were just uh, were just sort of whittled away or given up at some point as just being, that. I mean, I think that this is almost similar to how journalists today are no longer proper journalists. They don't care about the interests, or in some sense, they define the interests of the audience or the viewer or the reader, um, as a kind of what is best for them, and the means are justified by the ends. So their interests are not in a kind of fidelity to the process of investigating news stories. It's about the effect of what the news story will have on the audience, and that is how the interest of the audience is calibrated. What is good for them, not what is instead of, it's good to inform them so that they can make up their own mind, because they must be respected first. The sort of the decorum and standards of integrity are displaced by a calculus, um, the same kind of calculus in its cultural manifestation, that allows people to speak for the audience, "We are in mourning," because you can just apply generalizations in order to make calculus like that. You could just use generalized thinking instead of principled thinking. So, moral generalizations. Anyway, this is a kind of sort of argument from authority that comes to displace integrity, and that is generally, the general kind of collective narcissism that we see in the left ideology, that they always know more. Their facts are always sort of sacrosanct, and they have enough papers of agreement. They have all the citations or something like that, and anyone else who disagrees with them, well, those scientific papers, are controversial, and, oh well, that was just a few scientists, so they've got more scientists on their side. It's always this strange thing that makes a kind of absolute generalization, and they have no capability to actually substantively digest any issue. It all becomes this kind of, they have the facts and you have strange values, and they can't actually make their values susceptible because they have no substantiation other than their sort of fudged and thumbsucked sort of ivory tower, of pristine, it's very juvenile, but it's also, it just fundamentally lacks integrity. And it's interesting because a whole generation has this fascistic cultural values. this whole generation has this broken sexual cultural program that is, making it impossible for them to I would argue, these are different kinds of people now. These are the same types of people that were Nazis. It's a different kind of culture. They have been culturally indoctrinated into a different style of calibrating themselves in their own existential sense of being. They have to relate to an external locus of control. They can't. If you try to get them to reason from first principles or substantiate what they're saying with deductive reasoning, they can't do it. They need to have an epistemic reliabilism. They need to use inductive fudged thinking. That's the only way that they can continue to see themselves within the matrix in which they live. Um, it's very scary. They are a different breed of humanity, essentially, from a moral standpoint. They don't believe in principles. This is how you get legal positivism. This is how you get the kind of authoritarian measures, that the kind of policy that they wish to see from the state, operates. They get 51%. They can legislate whatever the hell they want. That's the sort of calculus there. Anyway, that's the kind of argumentation that they are capable of being prey to. Obviously, what makes it especially egregious is that how their whole worldview is essentially hinged on an ideological scapegoat. Um, because you can mop up cognitive dissonance and manufacture fudging just by saying that there's a bad actor in the system that is making the noise of confusion. And so if it doesn't look obvious as to what we should do, it's because there's a bad apple that is actually infiltrating what would otherwise be a perfectly workable sociological engine of uh, of sort of the moral cream rising to the top, and it always being obvious what the right thing to do is, and we just need to follow the zeitgeist. That the fly in the ointment of their sort of totalitarian culture that always is correctly intentioned. So the kind of, oh well, our morals are so intentioned, just plug yourself into the program. Never mind thinking about first principles and substantiations and deductive reasoning. We're past that. We make absolute claims based on the science because the science is simple and the science just has one answer. The science always has one answer, or some crazy nonsensical bullshit like that. Anyway, I mean, even having to defuse the cognitive dissonance that their whole project is based on is a parasitic, sort of, that is the kind of the shadow that they're casting in terms of having an active understanding and an active masculine energy, which is robbed from individuals in society. It's robbed from the culture itself. It's denigrated within the culture, and it's replaced by a project of infantilism and bestowed authority from some kind of top down prescription or anyway. So you have a culture which is no longer made up of independent nodes of independent thinking, but cultural forms and cultural conventions are everything. um, what is the science, and controlling the semantic rigor, and that correlates to all these things, and being able to talk about some sort of name drop sophisticated, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, that's a fallacy, um, in this very strange, unself-conscious you know, what I find particularly strange is how much they can make up arguments which don't actually conform to the substantive case, how they can, essentially produce a retort which is meant to be some kind of contradiction, and it doesn't actually improve the state of their case. In fact, it even perhaps undermines their case, but they can't even track the substantive reason that they're even relying on, because they're not interested in any kind of principled, substantive worldview. They don't have one. It's all hinged on a reactive mentality that is pegged to a scapegoat, an ideological scapegoat, that we need to root out the the source of some kind of imposed and perpetrated resistance to the cultural hegemonic program. In some sense, it's like find the why people aren't conforming and convince them why there's so much evidence that their unconformism is essentially a sign of their misguided and stupidity. It's all the while, you know, making very sure that you don't have anything like first principles, because everything is essentially just a shell game of a naked argument from authority. And so they talk about other people's fallacies, but they can't even see their own argument from authority. Uh, it's I mean, it's interesting that the kinds of Ponzi scheme that their whole worldview is based on. That as long as their prospective hypothetical proposition uh, uh, has some kind of possibility of continuingly been doubled down upon, it is, so they can sort of disguise the fact that this whole thing is based on the commitment that they must be always be capable of being regarded as right. And everyone could potentially have that hypothesis that, well, if we just continue down this road, eventually we can collect the evidence that will show that we were right all along. But, there's no, and you have to prove it deductively that they are wrong before they stop. They just need the possibility that they might be right if they can just continue on their general project. And so the whole thing is an inductive sort of gamble and fudged Ponzi scheme. And they grant themselves the right to do this because it's so important to have a cultural narcissism and a collective, sort of totalitarian project, because otherwise they would be lost in society. There would be no true north because they can't have an independent compass, essentially. Um, so they have a kind of collectivist epistemic reliabilism. They don't. They are dependent on external green lights, essentially. And I mean, this is essentially why they are sort of broken people. They will produce horrible, horrific cultural and also moral disasters, and they won't notice it because it'll be the necessary cost of the version of humanity that, I mean, these are basically like tribalists. I mean, obviously their tribalism is a kind of proto-fascism because they believe that everyone should be equally tribal, and that each person's tribalism should somehow be mediated, within a kind of under the auspices of a sort of a rainbow Hitler, and the kind of the necessary segregation that will be, all the strange cognitive dissonance, because just it doesn't work, and how you have to try to make it work is just it. I mean, it's sort of, well, all the and then whoever creates the resistance to this, well, they're outnumbered in the literature, or blah blah blah. That always the science is simple for them, the facts are simple for them, and other people have got questionable values. It's this strange insulation of a essentially a bankrupt project, uh, but they're just going with the flow and essentially relying on an argument from authority. Um, but anyway, I mean, these are the people who need. I mean, I don't have any intellectual sympathy for them. I mean, these are the people who quite frankly, these are the people that hellfire was made for, if I could put it poetically like that. They literally are the chaff in the spiritual domain. I mean, this is why we as a species or as a culture, this is why we don't have nice things, is because this is the evil of man, and it thinks itself to be fundamentally a kind of lowest common denominator. Sort of it sees itself as just well, it's just this is what basic humanity is, or something like that. Well, if it is, then this is why we don't deserve nice things. Anyway, the lack of discerning and almost the virulent commitment to not discerning. I mean, I guess you could describe it as armor, or as sort of the inculcation of a kind of a self-commitment to alienating one's own intelligence, or something like that. But anyway, I think that you have to blame these people for their disgusting dispositional sort of constitution. I mean, you can't say, oh well, they're ignorant. No, this is a kind of morally charged nescience. Anyway, I mean, that's a bit of a diatribe for me to complain about those people, but in some sense, the thing that is really most evil about them, sociologically speaking, is that they are, in breaking down division between, let's say, secular and private and public morality, having different pools of let's say, a secular public morality and a partisan private morality. They're wanting to merge these two things, essentially, fundamentally, and they're just being one thing, is a kind of psychological terrorism. And that is exactly also how fascist politics spreads. I mean, Hitler, for instance, arrived eventually into power because he exhausted his own population. A lot of people that voted for Hitler didn't like him. They explicitly voted for him because they thought that then they wouldn't have to listen to the propaganda anymore. They thought that, well, he keeps on complaining. If he has political power, surely we don't need to hear more about this, because then he actually had, if he keeps on complaining about these conspiracies, well, if he holds all the levers of power, then he can't say that things are infiltrated, because he will be in charge. That's not how it works. When you give these people power, then that's when the hyper-realism kicks up a notch. That's when the cognitive dissonance just gets more and more absolutely crazy and spiraling out of control. Anyway, also because the mythology is just it's so fundamentally corrupting. It's so easy to just basically say that the people who are, because you have two sources. You have the mythology around the conspiracy theory of the identity, and you have actual practical problems every day, and you can just conflate these two. And so if anything isn't succeeding, you can just say, well, it's the conspiracy. And if anyone doesn't go along with you, if anyone resists your political program, then you can also say that that is also part of the conspiracy. So you've got like a one-size-fits-all category of breaking down and keeping broken down what would be a healthy division between public morality and private morality. And let's say public secular politics and private, partisan, moral consideration and cultural soft power. And so, yeah, the merging of these two things, I think, is um, now, in some sense, I do think that I do have to be careful and perhaps even make separate arguments, because is a bit of an over reduction to some versions of the right that want to see some values entrenched in law or etched into the legal framework, because there are some freedoms and some rights, as it were, which I mean, I touch on this issue when I talk about abortion and things like that, which is, in some sense, it is kind of fringe to this, because there are, yeah, I mean, I think that this issue is, you know, like, let's say some Christians who might want to outlaw alcohol or drug use because it would be better for the moral health of a society. I am actually quite sensitive to that. That is a kind of perennial hard problem, because it really does seem like that would be, it would be good in a generalist way, in a generalized utilitarian way. It would be better. You could make that argument, but it comes at the cost of destroying the secular division. And in some sense, the secular division, I must say, the abortion argument is then even a more fringe case of this that needs its own separate treatment, because that is a real problem. Because I do think that fundamentally there is an intersection of rights between the bodily autonomy of the mother or the female and the right to life of the unborn child. Like, I think that those two rights are overlapped. They are potentially in conflict. Saying that they aren't in conflict is slightly insulting to saying that it's impossible for a female to believe that they are in conflict. I think that you can't speak for somebody else in that way. I think that we also have to respect freedom of conscience. So the idea that you have to imagine that it's impossible for a woman to legitimately think that these things are in conflict, I think we have to take people at their word. If they say that they believe it's in conflict, I also believe that they are technically, hypothetically in conflict. That's enough to say that on a secular level, it's going to be controversial either way. And I think that because it's controversial on some technical level, there must be a secular respect of that controversy, and that secular respect needs to create a gray area. It has to create some kind of gray area to respect that controversy at the very least. Otherwise, you do not preserve a liberal order. Essentially, you have to, I believe, institutionalize a liberal order. I'm not saying that abortion should be legal in any and every circumstance. I think that there should just be a window. There needs to be a window. Even if, you know, which is going to be more and more interesting, because as technology and medical things maybe change in the future, the gray area needs to, I mean, I've already explored this in the kind of science fiction sense that I've gone through all the ways in which that this will change in the future. And I think that the gray area becomes even more important to respect, because are we really going to have a state that is like a nanny state, but like a moral nanny, chasing after people, trying to force them to live up to moral standards which they themselves don't want to? Obviously, you know, that's what that's what the criminal law is meant to stop people from doing, is harm of other people. And I understand that, you know, if you take that the unborn life is its own person, but you are essentially, I think, contravening, or let's say contradicting, in some sense, you in this kind of moral imperialism of the traditional right or something like that, you end up undermining certain basic institutions which are needed to reproduce humanity itself, like the family unit. Are you not then undermining the family unit if you say that, well, we're going to have a technological state, a technocratic state that's going to save the life of every unborn child by everyone that wants to have an abortion. Let's instead of having an abortion, let's have the unborn child be abducted and then just gestated in some kind of science fiction incubation machine, and then they can grow up in the state, or be adopted or something like that. And then you've preserved the life. And then what have you done? You've created a worse moral hazard. So, and then you've also created a kind of a state. You're going to have to reproduce the family within the state or something like that to actually tie all that up, like, and then what have you done to humanity? You've done something to humanity in which it's not connected to its own culture. It's sort of that there's a simulated state variant of it. And I mean, I do think that is fundamentally, that is a kind of moral consequence which is slightly hidden within the absolutist sort of conservative supposed values claim that the state needs to absolutely stick up for the unborn child. I think that it's much better just to say, look, there is a window in which it's legal to have an abortion. After that window, it's on you, essentially. Then you've basically chosen to keep the child, and therefore you have consented, or you knew that essentially that you were going through with this, or something like that. And yes, it's difficult, and then you're living with the consequences of your own decision, and you've kind of got an institutionalization of bootstrapped agency, that at least people can say, well, actually, I didn't, because then people can't complain that they didn't choose to have their child, because they did have a window, essentially. And so that, I think, is the more responsible, practical, and also the pragmatic legal sort of institutionalization that needs to happen. And I understand, we can't just abstract morality into, there are multivariant things that have to sort of be taken. And I think that I have somewhat responsibly surveyed the moral components of this thing, and essentially, anyway, and there are other moral arguments to be made, which I make in the standalone recording about abortion, about how this is the only way that you actually really get a true culture of life, because it's not imposed. And so then you can actually convince people of their own moral consideration. It's not just a sociological fact that this is how the police enforce the law. It actually matters what people believe themselves as to the decision that, so yeah, I mean, I talk about the maturity of allowing bad things to happen, because society should be a reflection of the constitution of its members, the values and moral constitution of its individual member citizens. And when we try to clean up the symptoms of moral problems, if we make the state control the symptoms, then we do get a bit of a runaway culture, I think, to some degree, or we get a bit of a sort of a culture that lacks the transparency and the integrity and the fidelity to actually have significant communication between citizens, because in some sense the communication doesn't matter unless it amounts into changing the law and imposing a sociological enforcement of a value. That's the only moral issue that becomes pertinent then, because the state is essentially the arbiter of these things, that it doesn't matter what the culture believes. The culture being an amalgamate of its individual people and what they actually believe and think. Anyway, okay, I think I've made this argument as much as I can, but so yeah, I do see that the sort of the culture of the left of identity politics is a direct affront to this thing, that is a direct affront to the psychological boundaries of, let's say, public secular morality and private partisanship of values. They're wishing to merge this into a sociological system of enforcement and arguments of authority that the science is on their side. This is this is, this is the Darwinism theory that fueled the Nazis. This is that fueled the Aryan studies. Aryan studies, critical race studies. It's all the same bullshit. It's all the same cultural project and program. Anyway, um, okay, yeah, I'm just prattling on now, giving basic evidence as to confirm my general thesis. But anyway, I think that this is the true culture war. This is the true grounds of a culture war, and it's important not to fall into the program of the enemy, as it were, or to just have the pendulum swing the other way. This is now an addendum. I'm going to get into talking about some other sort of adjacent political issues around this. What I've said sort of cuts into America to some degree. But America is a very interesting sort of exception that proves the rule to some degree, because the project of America, the framing of America, is very interesting. I mean, it was almost sociologically crafted so that the politics of America would drive a culture that would eventually get into understanding the argument that I'm making in some sense. So it's sort of like it's an inductive cultural project to eventually grow the appreciation of this theme that I'm trying to lay out. Potentially. Sorry, I should have framed this addendum slightly differently at the beginning, that, this has a very interesting expression in the realm of legality and legal frameworks. Because I think that the law itself needs to have a sensitivity which would allow people to fight back against people who are trying to collapse the liberal order of the public secular domain and the private partisan values. Like, there need to be legal, there needs to be law that exists in principle, in substance, that can be used to keep these boundaries from blurring. America, in some sense, doesn't have that kind of legal system. It doesn't have that kind of sophisticated legal system, but instead they have a politics that is capable of culturally litigating some kind of political solution to that, because the law in America is not fixed. The law in America is an experiment that is unfolding. The substance of law in America is trial and error, and it's trial and error being driven by the culture. So the culture is trying out the form of law that is, so their politics is literally the process of imagining the solution. So it's a cultural engine towards appreciating the argument that I'm making, I would argue. But it is not the rule of law. It is a kind of rule of man, but it is a rule of man that puts man under a microscope, and for the issue to be on display, and for the spiritually minded to act. But the problem is that is only accessible in high politics, in political digestion, in actually thinking about the political issue, uh, you know, and campaigning, perhaps about it, or and in some sense that makes the moral issue. It makes it subject to a plebiscite, to a vote, which is, anyway. I mean, I would say that is, sort of like, you have to keep on voting the right way, otherwise you lose your freedom. Is kind of, you're put under the gun, and you have to collectively vote the right way, because if you're the minority and you get voted out, then you lose your freedom. It's kind of, and in some sense, the only thing that saves you then is that hopefully you have a militia, or you have enough guns in the population that there are some de facto lines that won't be crossed, or something like that. And so the culture has some some kind of insurance policies as to securing its independence from the breakdown of the boundaries that I've been discussing is at the core of the cultural drive of the evil and stupid and psychologically dysfunctional so-called progressives. Okay, so oh man, I'm just rambling too much now. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, for me, I'm going to probably title this recording something like "The True Essence of the Culture War" or something like that. Now, this addendum is trying to just deal with some institutionalized structures and how they would deal with these issues. And I think that the South African legal framework is actually, on paper, it's perfect. It's been institutionally corrupted by judges that have essentially read critical race theory into the law itself. They have used it even to interpret the Constitution. They have invented things which they've actually even taken from America, which has corrupted what is otherwise the South African legal tradition and system is, and I know that this will make me sound like a partisan, but I think that I am correct. It is the best legal system in the world, barring its corruption, because it has been completely laid waste to. It has been completely turned upside down. It has betrayed itself overtly. But I mean, I think that it's somewhat obvious how it has been corrupted, and it is in clear contravention of its own principles and values. But an example of this is that the Constitution has a limiting clause, a limitations clause that says how every right in the Constitution can be limited. This is actually a good thing, because it means that you can very clearly make an argument as to why your rights shouldn't be limited, and your rights become incredibly justiciable, where in America, your constitutional rights are worth very little because they're so absolute, because the judge will just interpret them as not being contravened. So they're worthless. They're void for vagueness. They don't have clear remedies, which is, whenever you have big constitutional cases, the problem is that there just isn't a remedy for the contravention of your rights. It's pathetic. That doesn't happen in the South African system in theory. But then what they've done is they've invented something which they took from overseas law. They said, well, no, the government has a prerogative. The governmental prerogative of the right of the government to make legislation around issues, and we don't have to look at the limitations clause and have an argument about if the limitation is justifiable, because the government has a prerogative to just make policy in some aspect. And so they have actually given up the supremacy of the Constitution. The courts have uh, uh, been remiss in their constitutional duty and role and obligation. Uh, uh, it's pathetic. They have subordinated themselves. They don't fulfill their role. They have betrayed the Constitution, and they have done so for semantic reasons by essentially reading critical race theory into the affirmative action stuff that's in the Constitution. And they refuse to actually apply uh, the limitations clause and the explicit subcomponents of the limitations clause by reading into it a governmental prerogative which is not mentioned in the limitations clause. Uh, it's I mean, that is something which is, I would argue, is essentially a kind of crime against humanity in some sense, in that, this issue this cultural issue, as it has a legal expression, and in some sense, it only has a legal expression in the most sophisticated legal system in the world, which I've argued is South Africa. And so, in principle, this issue should have been prevented through the courts. This issue should have been there are legal cases to be made against this corruption of the state and this subversion of liberal democracy and liberal values. But that has not happened because of the institutionalized corruption that has been a part of this fascistic cultural slide in this disgusting totalitarian worldview which has taken over politics and culture. There should have been a legal resistance to it in South Africa, but there wasn't. Anyway, but still, there are clues as to how you have a legal framework that solves for these problems, but it does kind of cut across America. It's not really compatible exactly with the form that America has taken. And that is, I think, a fundamental problem. That in some sense, identity politics is the perfect opponent for the weaknesses of the American system of government and law. Um, and so, in some sense, I think that identity politics is the right kind of poison that will force America to up its to gain immunity to. Oh, sorry, this is. I'm sorry. I'm trying to make a homeopathy kind of analogy when I say poison. It's the right. Anyway, but America can digest it in its own way as well. It doesn't have to go the way that I've proposed. It can just kind of create a cultural understanding about these issues, um, which is in some sense what is happening to some degree. Um, but essentially, I just think it's a bit crude to use democracy as the solution to a fundamentally principled problem, but it sort of forces everyone to be on the same page to some degree and to have a shared political culture or something like that. I just think it's slightly undignified to sort of be carried along by the zeitgeist in this way, because anyway, I think that therefore there are sort of structural problems, and I've already said that the solution to those structural problems is something like the South African structure, which, sadly is a very bad example of itself because of essentially corrupt personnel. Judges have been appointed that are politically, essentially, that they have sentiments and they have beliefs which are pliable and facilitate the politics, the political corruption, which is in some sense completely invested in this world, in this fascistic totalitarian worldview, is essentially of being able to just semantically redefine the meaning of things in order to cover up your own sort of lack of principles and substantive reasoning. There's very little reason at the core of this. There's very little values. It's just sort of, well, we can just redefine things to mean things differently. Um, it's the same way that the legal system in Weimar Germany or in Nazi Germany, how that metastasized with its legal positivism. But yeah, there aren't principles at the core of it. It's just kind of how the law is formulated and then how it can be semantically reframed. Uh, there's no end to that. Therefore, the law itself doesn't even try to have value. It doesn't even try to inscribe values. It just says, "Oh, well, you just need this number. You just need this percentage. That's the only thing that matters." Okay, I've devolved into a bit of an embarrassing, sort of investigation of this moral issue. But I mean, what I'm just trying to point out is that the American system sort of puts pressure on this individual moral private values and partisanship to force itself to be expressed in the public domain and to debate it in the public domain, and under a kind of threat that otherwise your moral values and partisanship is going to be stepped on by the collective state or something like that. where the collective power of the democracy. And I do think that that whole structure is somewhat undignified, although I can commend that it culturally is an engine towards a kind of, it's America seems to almost kind of be like an altar that can perform, you know, the, that in some sense can be that is trying to prepare itself to uh, uh, take possession of, sort of the fire of truth, or something like that. It's trying to prepare itself, but it's an unlit altar, waiting for a proper synthesis that it's actually trying to make way for, um, arriving at. So it's sort of it's a waiting altar, or something like that. Anyway, and there's an interesting parallel in Revelations to that, but I'll just say as well that uh, so I mean they are putting. I mean it's also interesting contrasting that with, sort of how from other religions America is for sociological reasons how it's vilified. I mean there are versions of Islam that slander America as the great Satan, and in some sense they see the internal sociological chaos, which is in some sense the exact opposite of Islam, because Islam has there is some debate among scholars, but that debate is never on the level of values and principles. You can only argue on symbolically what things mean. There's an analogical extrapolation of Sharia law. Sharia law doesn't function on principles. It functions on dictates, which gets in a series of concatenation gets symbolically um, elaborated. Uh, so what America is doing is essentially is anyway. I mean, I disagree with. I would say that I'm critical of both, because the one because it's unprincipled, the other one because in some sense it's toying with principles a bit too dangerously, or it puts everything on the line, hoping that the culture will develop and digest and actually keep the altar of liberty viable, or something like that. But the problem that I see with America is that the altar never gets lit. It never gets completed, or at least, or it's sort of some sense. I mean, I do respect America in terms of its design, because in some sense I think that it does have this spiritual project built into it, perhaps deliberately so, that they on purpose did not create a perfect structure. They created an imperfect structure that would pursue its refinement, or something like that, and that refinement would be a cultural fruit. It would be it would have to be reflected in the culture. So they were actually trying to cultivate uh, sort of a human project that tries to create a cultural consciousness about these things. But I mean, again, I don't think that these things belong in a secular culture. They in the public side. They belong in the freedom of association side, in the private sphere, and merging these two and mixing these two, I do think is slightly undignified, but also that you are forcing people to risk everything under the weight of the democracy, or something like that. Anyway, which, it has some de facto truth to it, because I mean, should you really want to live in a society where in principle things are correct? Eh, look, I mean, that's the moral calculus and comparison. Sorry, maybe I should finish that statement before I knock it down. But what I'm arguing for, though, is that this division between the public secular and the private partisan values is needed just for psychological sanity. And it's the psychological sanity itself which is being burdened and threatened by the form of government in America, or by the structure of the state in America, that then compels people to engage in this kind of injecting their values um, into the law of trial and error in America, which is the form of law, uh, which is the form that law takes in America, the form taken on by law in America. And we need to have the rule of law, not the rule of man. And America is fundamentally the that's my biggest gripe with America, is that the defect is in the law itself, because America does not have stable substantive law. The only thing stable in its law is the Constitution, and the Constitution is void for vagueness, essentially, in terms of the rights that it bestows on people. So it's anyway, and it's got this cultural treadmill or political compromise, which does have a sociological fruit attached to it, but the cost, the expense of it, I think is a fundamental indignity which threatens a kind of psychological sanity in some sense. So I do think that it puts the basic boundaries, it makes it a political football to some degree, which is, I mean, in some sense, maybe that's culturally necessary, because maybe without that you can't even sustain, let's say, the flame of liberty. But I'm trying to argue that America doesn't actually truly have the flame of liberty. It has the promise of holding the flame as an altar, but that it has not come together um, to actually have that true flame. Um, anyway, so I just wanted to say that we need to have a culture, or sorry, we need to have a structure of a society that has enough integrity that it actually has a legal defense of these boundaries, so that it can actually, so that the secular side can conserve itself and also not overrun its own container. And in some sense, what I'm arguing for might seem strange to some people, because in some sense I'm being a partisan for having a structure, a sociological structure, or a legal framework that is trying to keep the world alive. And I mean this in the spiritual language of the world and the spirit. That I want the world to be distinct from the spirit, and the only way to do that is to have boundaries that distinguish the world and distinguish the private partisan values. And without that basic distinction, and getting it to bleed together, you might be able to concoct some interesting, contrived design that has some interesting, that is producing some interesting interference in how those things are being forced to be bedfellows, or how those things are forced to interact and synthesize, which is, I think, what's happening in America to some degree, which, again, like, I do have admiration for the cultural production in America to some degree, but I do think that it is a leavened compromise to some degree, which I've tried to make those arguments. Um, and essentially, you can't even get spiritual partisan values clarity in the Christian sense, I would argue, unless you have a clear distinction between the public secular and the private partisan values. And so, what I'm arguing for is not is not, it's weird because I'm arguing for both simultaneously, but I'm arguing for a clear distinction to be maintained so that we can actually see where things, we can actually have a framework in which a cultural signpost that allows us to navigate and see where our own moral values and minds end, and where society and politics and the layers of society and the issues of society, just so that they sort of, I mean, look, it's not as if the kind of boundary that I'm demanding or that I think is so necessary is not the solution. It's not even the solution. I think it's just a necessary prerequisite to being able to even fathom a solution, because otherwise everything is just so fundamentally intersected that you don't even have a potential view of agency and uh, uh, because anyway, because the culture itself is so fundamentally, sort of mixed up. So in some sense, like I'm not even, yeah, I mean, it's weird because I'm someone trying to describe the psychological necessity of having certain basic liberal values entrenched in the legal framework of the state, so that individual agency is fundamentally respected, is institutionalized, has some symbolic institutionalization. And I say symbolic because from the private partisan value side, it can only ever be symbolic. It can't be proof. It can just be symbolic of it. But it's just a signpost to tell you that, yes, you do actually have agency. It's just a kind of, it doesn't prove that you have agency. You have to evaluate that for yourself. But at least there is a sociological signpost um, gesturing at it. And so there is some kind of outward uh, clue as to these important internal truths. And I do think, I mean, I've made this case in other recordings, but essentially, I believe that the reason why we live in the kind of mess that we live in is because of how the legal framework actually enshrines and treats individual rights and liberal agency and stuff like that. That it does have this weird confection of authority which is not justified in principle, etc., etc. And and these things are violated when it's like, well, you can't do this because it's for your own good, kind of thing. I think that your parent can do that to you, but your state should not do that to you. Your parent can say that to you, but the state should not say that to an adult individual that is compos mentis. It's undignified. And so we live in the we live in a society in which we have already been denigrated. We've already been infantilized from the legal, from essentially kind of how the legal system um, frames the individual. And until we, I think, institutionalize the correction of that denigration, I think that does bleed into the culture. I think that the mores and the social norms that are institutionalized in the legal framework eventually become the culture. And that is what has happened. That I know that that sounds like a really strange intellectual argument, that how people are treated on an abstract legal conceptual level eventually gets mirrored by the common culture. I think that is essentially true. And I think that America has even disintegrated along those lines. At the beginning of America, everyone was a lawyer. There were so many lawyers, so many people were interested in the law and structures and civics and things like that. And under the weight of their own contradictions and under the sort of the elaboration and expansion of the law of admiralty, um, and the sort of the institutionalization of infantilism and a kind of unprincipled arguments from authority, we have lost the integrity of the individual because it has not been enshrined in the legal structure. Okay, anyway, that's my thesis. Okay, and I've tried to explore this issue from many different angles. Um, and this is also why the South African constitution held so much promise, but essentially now it has just been relegated as a kind of dead weight because it's just been pushed around, and the words in it have been so disgustingly reinterpreted and betrayed with semantic nonsense, with just semantic, sort of contrivance that it's really quite scary because sort of it feels like being exactly on the precipice of a horrible totalitarian slide or a further authoritarian um, spiral. Sort of depending on a kind of democratic deficit, on sort of continuing this disgusting culture of infantilizing the electorate and being a kind of paternalist authoritarian to them, and speaking to them like they are sort of vassals. Um, it's undignified, Or I mean, this is especially come out in the sort of in the themes of how uh, the lockdowns and how the pandemic has been orchestrated by the state. The response to the pandemic, how that's been orchestrated in the most sort of illiberal way, in using um, law and regulation and coercion and compulsion from the authority of the state rather than guidelines and information. It's a complete fundamental disrespect of the liberal um, principled structure. Man, I've just opened another can of worms. But anyway, I mean, I can recapitulate my whole argument in the subject matter of the pandemic itself, but I'm not going to do that uh, as but yeah, I mean, I've done that in a little bit in other recordings. But yeah, I could recontextualize the same philosophical thing within that. Anyway, let me just stop this recording now. It's gone on long enough.